she never begged, not once. Not when they stripped her badge from her chest like tearing skin, not when the headlines carved her name into something ugly, not when the hospital corridors she had walked for 6 years became the mouth of a lie that swallowed her whole. Kimberly stood in the rain outside Seoul Central Hospital the morning they escorted her out, her chin lifted, her jaw tight, her dark brown eyes holding a storm she refused to release in front of them. She was too proud for that. Too certain, even then, even bleeding, that the truth was still alive somewhere. She just couldn't find it yet. He saw her face on a screen 3 months later, and something cracked open in his chest that had been sealed shut for years. No Tae-sang was not a man who felt things. He was a man who controlled them. He ran the most powerful private legal enforcement network in South Korea, moved in spaces where judges owed him favors and prosecutors returned his calls before their morning coffee. He had built his empire on precision and silence. He did not react. He calculated. But something about the footage of her standing in that rain, spine straight, eyes burning, refusing to break, reached inside him and pulled. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected her at all. Welcome to Afro Korea Stories by Yem Besties. Please like, share and subscribe. Kimberly had been a nurse for 9 years. 8 of those years she had given to Seoul Central Hospital. Long shifts, overnight emergencies, patients whose names she still remembered long after their files were archived. She was the kind of nurse who learned 3 words of every patient's native language, who remembered which elderly man took his medication better with warm water, who stayed 20 minutes past shift end to hold the hand of a woman afraid of the dark. She was also the kind of nurse that Dr. Gwak Byeong-chul resented. She had reported him twice. Once for a medication error he'd tried to bury under paperwork. Once for the way he spoke to a junior nurse who had cried in the supply room afterward and sworn Kimberly to silence. Both reports had been quietly absorbed by the administration and just as quietly forgotten. But Gwak Byeong-chul had not forgotten. Men like him never did. The theft accusation came on a Tuesday. A set of specialized surgical tools had gone missing from the secured supply cabinet. High value, tracked, irreplaceable. By noon, Kimberly's handbag had been searched by hospital security. By 1 p.m., 3 of the tools were inside it, wrapped in the inner pocket she rarely used. By 2 p.m., she was sitting across from the hospital director with her hands flat on the table, listening to Dr. Gwak speak in that low, measured tone he reserved for situations where he'd already won. "We have no choice," he said without looking at her. "The evidence is conclusive." There was no CCTV in the staff changing rooms, hospital policy, privacy of personnel. It was a protection that had just become a cage. She said, "I did not take anything." He said, "The items were found in your possession." She said it again. She said it calmly, clearly, and then she stopped saying it, because she could see from the director's eyes that the decision had already been made before she walked into the room. Dr. Gwak had gotten there first. He had allies she didn't have, history she couldn't rewrite, and a story that was already being packaged for internal review. The weeks that followed happened in a kind of cold blur. Her nursing license was suspended pending investigation. The investigation, led by a committee that included 2 of Gwak's closest colleagues, took 11 days. On the 12th day, her license was revoked. A hospital spokesperson released a brief statement. The statement was picked up by a mid-tier medical news outlet. That outlet's headline, "Foreign National Nurse Fired for Theft at Seoul Central," was picked up by 3 more. By the end of the week, her name existed in 4 languages attached to the word thief. She moved out of her apartment in Mapo-gu because she couldn't afford the rent. She moved into a smaller place in Eunpyeong-gu near her friend Jade, who worked as a translator and made enough to share groceries without making it feel like charity. She applied for nursing positions in 3 other hospitals. 2 rejected her before interview. 1 scheduled an interview and then cancelled it the morning of, citing a policy review. She started tutoring English online at 6 a.m. before the time zone difference made it too late for her European clients. She applied to a medical records processing company that didn't require a license. She did not cry about it. She allowed herself 1 hour the night her license was officially revoked, sitting on the floor of her new bathroom with the light off, breathing. Then she got up. She was fighting the revocation through a legal aid organization. But legal aid moved slowly, and Gwak's hospital had institutional lawyers who moved fast. Her caseworker, a young woman named Attorney Bay, was genuinely trying, but trying and winning were not the same thing. 3 months passed. Seo Dae-won was scrolling through his phone on a Sunday evening when he saw Kimberly's face. He was a quiet man, civil engineer, widower, father of 1 9-year-old girl named Seo Yuli, who was currently in the next room building something architectural out of couch cushions. He was not someone who followed medical news. He had been at Seoul Central Hospital only once, 4 months ago, when Yuli had a respiratory scare that turned out to be severe bronchitis and a very dramatic child. The headline stopped him. He read it once, then he read the article. Then he sat back and stared at the ceiling. He remembered the nurse. He had not known her name at the time, but he remembered her, the woman who had spoken to Yuli in English and then switched to French when Yuli inexplicably had responded better to it. The one who had explained the nebulizer treatment in 3 different ways until Yuli understood and stopped being terrified of it. The one who had found Yuli's dropped stuffed rabbit under the bed and returned it without comment, as if small dignities were simply part of the job. He sat with the uneasy feeling for 2 days. On the 2nd day, he was transferring old videos from his phone to clear storage when he found it. It was 11 seconds long. Yuli had taken it. He could tell immediately. The angle was child height, slightly tilted, the frame slightly unsteady in the way of small hands that didn't quite know how to hold a phone flat. She'd been playing with his device in the hospital corridor while he handled the discharge paperwork at the reception desk 20 meters away. He remembered giving it to her to keep her occupied. The video showed a corridor near the staff changing room. In the background, slightly out of frame but unmistakably present, a man in a white coat moved toward the changing room door. He glanced left. He glanced right. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. 7 seconds of hallway. Then the man emerged, hands in his coat pockets, walking quickly. The face was visible for exactly 3 seconds. It was Dr. Gwak Byeong-chul. Seo Dae-won watched it 4 times. His hands had gone very still. He was not a dramatic man. He did not leap to conclusions. But he had also spent 15 years as an engineer, and engineers understood one fundamental truth about evidence. It either supported the structure or it didn't. There was no middle ground. He thought about the nurse who had spoken to his daughter in French. He thought about the headline. He opened his contacts and looked for the one name he had that might know what to do with something like this. Someone who existed in a world where a video like this could become something more than 11 seconds of a bad man walking out of a room. He called No Tai-sang. They had gone to university together briefly. Tai-sang had been 2 years ahead, already legendary among law students for his ability to dismantle arguments with surgical calm. They had worked on one interdepartmental project together, stayed loosely in contact through mutual colleagues over the years, shared meals maybe 4 times in a decade. Dae-won trusted him the way you trusted a man who had never once lied to you, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Tae-sang answered on the second ring. "Seo Dae-won," he said, in that unhurried voice that made most people feel slightly evaluated. "It's been 8 months." "I have something," Dae-won said. "I need to know if it's what I think it is." Silence. Then, "Send it." Tae-sang watched the 11-second video 6 times without blinking. He was sitting at his desk on the 14th floor of the No Group's private legal offices in Gangnam. The city spread out beneath him like something he owned, which in certain practical senses he did. His assistant had left for the evening. The office was quiet in the way expensive spaces always were. Insulated, sealed, the kind of silence that cost money. He watched it a 7th time. Then he set his phone down and sat very still for a moment, which was unusual for him. No, Tae-sang was always moving, even when he appeared motionless, his mind cataloguing, sorting, building. But right now something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with the legal implications of what he'd just watched, which were considerable. He pulled up the article Dae-won had sent alongside the video. Her photograph was embedded halfway down the page. A press photo, probably pulled from the hospital's staff directory, professional, neutral, the kind of image designed to show competence rather than personality. But even in that flat, institutional frame, something about her came through. The angle of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the sense that whoever had taken that photo had tried to make her small and she had simply declined. He read the article once, then he closed it and called Dae-won back. "Where is she now?" he asked. "I don't know," Dae-won said. "The article is 3 months old." The video's timestamp. 4 months ago. 14 minutes after her shift started. Tae-sang looked at the city outside his window. "You understand what this is?" "I think so." It places him at that location during the window when the items were reported missing. It doesn't show him planting anything, but combined with the absence of any other viable suspect and the pattern of her prior reports against him, he stopped. "It's enough to reopen, possibly enough to reverse." Dae-won exhaled. "I thought so. That's why I called you." "I'll need the original file. Not a copy, the original from your device. Chain of custody matters." "I know. And Dae-won." Tae-sang paused. "You did the right thing." He hung up. He sat for another moment in the expensive silence. Then he told his assistant, via message because it was 9 p.m. and she was gone but never truly unreachable, to find him everything publicly available on one Kimberly, formerly of Seoul Central Hospital's surgical nursing unit. By morning he had a file. She was 29, originally from Accra, Ghana, raised partly in London, nursing degree from King's College, additional certification in surgical assist from Yonsei University in Seoul. She had been in South Korea for 6 years. Her Korean was, according to 3 separate patient reviews he found on a hospital feedback archive, excellent. She had received internal commendations in 4 consecutive years. She had filed 2 formal complaints against Dr. Gwak Byeong-chul, both logged, neither acted upon. She had no criminal record anywhere. She had no history of disciplinary action before this incident. She was currently registered at an address in Yunpyeong-gu. He looked at the commendation records longer than was strictly necessary for legal purposes. Then he had his assistant send a formal letter to her last known address, requesting a meeting at her earliest convenience regarding a matter of significant legal relevance to her case. The letter was precise, professional, and gave nothing away, standard for him. He signed it himself, which was not standard, but he did it anyway without examining why. Kimberly almost threw the letter away. She had received 3 pieces of correspondence in the past month that looked official and turned out to be either scam attempts preying on people in legal trouble or worse, journalists who had found her address and were angling for comment. She'd learned to be careful with envelopes that arrived looking important, but the no group letterhead was real. She checked. She checked twice, because she had learned not to trust first impressions of good news, which had a habit of dissolving on contact. Jade read it over her shoulder at the kitchen table. "No Tai Sang," she said slowly, in the tone of someone accessing a database. "Private legal enforcement. Not a law firm exactly. More like a strategic legal operation. He takes cases the courts move too slowly on. She paused. "Kimberly, he's extremely well connected." "I gathered. Why would he contact you?" "I don't know." She folded the letter along its original crease. "But I'm going to find out." The no group offices were everything she'd expected and nothing she'd prepared for. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was habitual, and was shown to a waiting area that was less a room and more an architectural statement. Clean lines, pale stone, enormous windows that made Seoul look like a painting someone had hung for scale. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her expression neutral and told herself this was just another meeting, the same as the 14 other meetings she'd had in the past 3 months with people who could theoretically help her and had not. She was good at neutral. She had been practicing it for months. When his assistant led her down a corridor and through a door, she had approximately 3 seconds before she saw him. It shouldn't have mattered what he looked like. It didn't, she told herself immediately. It absolutely did not matter. But no Tai Sang stood at the window with his back half-turned, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, and when he turned at the sound of the door, his eyes found her with an immediacy that felt less like noticing and more like recognition, as if some part of him had already been waiting and had now confirmed something it had suspected. She held his gaze evenly. She was good at that too. "Ms. Kim," he said. His voice was lower in person than she'd imagined from the letter's formal tone, measured, unhurried. The voice of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "Mr. No," she said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He sat. He opened a folder on the desk between them and turned it to face her. Inside was a printed still from a video. Dr. Gwak Byeong-chul caught mid-stride, face turned just enough to be identifiable. Timestamp in the corner. Hospital corridor, staff changing room door visible in the frame. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, her voice was steady. "Where did this come from?" "A child," he said. 9 years old. She was playing with her father's phone in the corridor while he handled discharge paperwork. She recorded it without knowing what she'd captured. "Her father saw the news about your case 2 days ago and recognized the location." Kimberly looked back down at the photograph. Something moved through her chest. Not relief yet, too complicated for that. More like the first tremor before something massive shifts. "Is it enough?" she asked. "To reopen the investigation, yes. To reverse the revocation." He paused, and she appreciated that he didn't finish with false comfort. "Likely, with the right approach. And you're offering that approach." I'm offering to build it. His eyes hadn't left her face. If you'll let me. She met his gaze again. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully categorize. Professional, yes, but underneath that, something that moved like current beneath still water. She filed it away without acting on it. Why? She asked. He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of it. Good. She didn't have the time or the energy for people who made her work to understand their motives. Because the evidence was suppressed, the investigation was compromised, and a man in a position of institutional power used that position to destroy a professional he perceived as a threat. He said it evenly, but something sharpened behind his eyes. I find that particular combination of circumstances, a pause, intolerable. She studied him. And the father, she said. He came to you specifically. We know each other. He trusted me with it. Do you take every case a friend brings you? No, he said. I don't. The word landed quietly between them. She let it sit there. What do you need from me? She asked. He opened a second page of the folder. Everything. Your original reports against Gwak, your account of the day the items were found, every interaction you had with him in the 3 months prior, every name on that investigation committee. Attorney Bay from Legal Aid already has most of that. Then I'll work with Attorney Bay. No hesitation, no ego. This isn't about replacing what you've built, it's about adding what you're missing. She looked at the photograph one more time. 9 years old. A child bored in a hospital corridor with a phone, recording something she didn't understand, handing justice to a stranger by accident. All right, Kimberly said, let's build it. They met 4 more times in the following 2 weeks. Each meeting was scheduled, professional, structured around the legal architecture Tai-sang was quietly constructing around her case. He was methodical in a way that felt almost physical. The way he organized information, built arguments in layers, anticipated counterpoints before they existed. Kimberly had worked with surgeons who operated the same way, absolute precision, no wasted movement. She respected it. She was also, despite herself, increasingly aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with legal strategy. It happened in small accumulations. The way he listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, processing it, sometimes sitting with it for a full beat before responding. The way he remembered details she'd mentioned once and referenced them exactly when relevant. The way he never once looked at her case file, the way the legal aid committee had, with that particular blend of sympathy and low expectation that she'd learned to recognize and despise. He looked at it like a problem that had a solution. Like the solution was already there and they just needed to uncover it. She found that unreasonably, dangerously attractive. She did not do anything about that. She had enough problems. The 4th meeting ran long. They had moved from the formal conference setup to his actual desk by the 3rd session, which felt like a small shift but wasn't. It meant the distance between them had reduced to the width of a workspace instead of an institutional table, and she was aware of that the way you're aware of a change in air pressure before weather arrives. It was past 8 in the evening. His assistant had gone home. The city outside had shifted from amber to dark blue, Seoul skyline pressing bright shapes against the night. He was walking her through the committee structure of the investigation. 3 of 5 members had direct professional ties to Gwak, which was the kind of conflict of interest that looked like an accident until you mapped it, and then it looked like architecture. If we can demonstrate the committee was compromised before the investigation began, he said, leaning over the desk to indicate something in the document spread between them. then the findings aren't just wrong, they're procedurally void. The entire thing collapses. His arm was close to hers. She was aware of it the way you were aware of something warm nearby in a cold room. The nursing board still accepted the findings, she said, keeping her voice level. The nursing board accepted a report from a committee they believed was independent. He straightened. They didn't know what they were rubber stamping. Once we show them what they actually approved. He paused. Their instinct will be to distance themselves from it as fast as possible. We use that instinct. She nodded slowly. You're not arguing the truth at them, you're making the lie inconvenient. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. No, Tae-sang didn't appear to smile often, but a quality of attention that sharpened, as if she'd said something that matched a frequency he operated at. Exactly, he said. The word came out quieter than his others. She looked up because of it, and for a moment neither of them moved. She was the one who looked away first. She picked up her copy of the document and found a thread to pull. The video timestamp puts Gwak at the changing room 14 minutes into my shift. The tools were reported missing at what time exactly? He answered. They continued. But the air in the room had changed slightly, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Attorney Bay was 26, sharp, and deeply suspicious of No Tae-sang. She expressed this to Kimberly over the phone the morning after their introduction meeting with a directness Kimberly had come to rely on. He's not doing this for free, Attorney Bay said. Men like that don't. There's either a professional angle I'm not seeing or it's personal. Which one worries me more? I haven't decided. He's building a case that benefits us, Kimberly said. I know. I'm watching him do it and it's impressive. That's why I'm suspicious. A pause. How does he look at you? Kimberly was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. Kimberly. Like I'm a case he intends to win, she said firmly. Attorney Bay made a sound that communicated deep skepticism without requiring words. Focus, Kimberly said. Tell me about the committee documentation. 3 weeks into the preparation, Gwak moved. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that only read as a threat if you knew what to look for. A second article appeared, this one in a more prominent publication, citing an anonymous hospital source who described Kimberly as having had a pattern of concerning behavior prior to the theft incident. The language was careful, legally insulated, but the implication was clear. She was not the victim she was positioning herself as. She was building a narrative. Tae-sang called her the morning the article went live. I've seen it, she said, before he could speak. It's a warning shot. He knows something is moving. How? He has people watching. Everyone does. His voice was even, but there was an edge beneath it she hadn't heard before. He's trying to poison the pool before we get to court. Make any future jury or board predisposed to doubt you. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the street below. Yun Pyong-gu was quiet in the mornings, ordinary, unhurried, nothing like the hospital world she'd inhabited for years. She had been trying to make herself feel at home here. She hadn't managed it yet. Can we move faster? She asked. I'm already moving faster than I normally would. A pause. Not the kind that meant he was searching for words. The kind that meant he was deciding how many of them to give her. Don't read the comments on the article. I don't. Good. Tae-sang. It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal address, and she heard the small silence it created. She pressed forward. Is there anything in this case that could come back on the child's father, on Seo Daewon? I've already structured his involvement to minimize exposure. The video is evidence he encountered in the normal course of clearing his phone storage. He had a legal and arguably moral obligation to bring it forward. There's no liability. The relief she felt was disproportionate, which told her something about how much space this case, these people, had begun to occupy. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for protecting a witness. I'm not thanking you for that." She paused. "I'm thanking you for thinking of it before I asked." Another silence. Different from the others. She felt it differently too. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We have work tomorrow." She almost said something else. She didn't. She hung up and stood at her window for a long moment, watching the ordinary street, feeling something in her chest that she was not ready to name. The second attack came 10 days later, and it was not subtle at all. Kimberly was walking back from a tutoring session, early evening, the kind of autumn dusk that turned Seoul streets gold and grey at the same time, when a car slowed alongside her. The window came down. The man inside was not someone she recognized, but the way he looked at her was the language of deliberate intimidation. "You should think carefully," he said in Korean, unhurried, "about how much further you want to take this." She kept walking. Her pulse had jumped, but her stride didn't. He said something else. She didn't stop. The car kept pace with her for 30 more seconds, then accelerated and was gone. She walked the remaining 6 minutes to her building without running because she refused to run, but her hands were shaking by the time she got the door open, and she stood in the entryway of her apartment for a full minute before she could make herself move normally again. She called Tae-sung. He answered in one ring this time. She told him what happened, voice flat and factual, the same way she'd learned to deliver bad news to patients' families. Information first, emotion processed later in private. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted long enough that she said, "Tae-sung, I'm here." His voice had changed. She couldn't fully describe how, only that the measured quality was still there, but underneath it something had pulled tight, like a cable under sudden load. "Are you home?" "Yes." "Lock your door." "It's already locked." "I'm sending someone tonight. Private security, someone I trust. They'll be outside the building." "That's..." She started to say unnecessary and stopped, because someone had just idled a car next to her on a public street to deliver a threat, and unnecessary was not the honest word. "Okay," she said instead. "Kimberly?" The way he said her name, she had noticed he used it rarely, and when he did it landed differently than it did in other people's mouths, with a weight and a precision that made it feel chosen. He's scared. This is what scared men do. "I know," she said. "It means we're close." "I know that too." She leaned against her locked door. "Doesn't make it less unpleasant." "No," he said, "it doesn't." Another pause, and then quieter. "I'm sorry this is happening to you." She closed her eyes briefly. "Go to sleep," he said. "I'll handle tonight." She didn't ask what that meant. She was learning by degrees that when No Tae-sang said he would handle something, the correct response was to believe him. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was because of the case, because an intimidation attempt against a key witness and plaintiff was a development that required immediate strategic response, which was true. He had calls to make, people to deploy, a chain of pressure to apply to Gwak's network that would make clear, without anything being said explicitly, that the playing field had just changed. He made those calls. He deployed those people. He applied that pressure. And then he sat in his office at midnight with the city burning silently outside his windows and admitted to himself, with the reluctant precision of a man who didn't lie to himself even when he wanted to, that none of that was why he was still awake. He was still awake because someone had rolled a car alongside her on a darkening street and spoken to her like a warning, and the image of it, even second-hand, even constructed from her flat, factual voice, had produced in him a response that was entirely disproportionate to professional concern. He wanted to find the man who had done it. That was the simple, unexamined truth of it. He wanted to find him and make very clear that it would not happen again, not through legal channels, not through measured strategic response, but in the direct and uncomplicated way that men who had been quietly dangerous for a long time sometimes chose when something that mattered to them was touched. He sat with that recognition for a moment. Then he filed it carefully behind everything more useful and went back to work. The security detail he sent was a man named Oh Hyun-gi, former close protection, recommended twice over, someone who understood that his job was presence without intrusion. Tae-sang briefed him personally at 11 p.m. and sent him to Yunpyeong-gu with instructions that were thorough enough to communicate, without stating it directly, that the person inside the building mattered. Oh Hyun-gi had worked for Tae-sang for 4 years and was paid well enough to never ask questions. He noticed the thoroughness of the briefing anyway. Kimberly woke the next morning to a message from Tae-sang, security in place. His name is Oh Hyun-gi. He'll introduce himself. Call me when you're up. She stared at it for a moment. Then she got up, made coffee and called. He answered before the second ring again. She was starting to notice the pattern of that. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine. I slept." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "You didn't." A brief pause. "What makes you say that?" The message timestamp. "And your voice." Another pause. This one with a different texture to it, something almost careful. "The intimidation attempt changes our timeline. I want to file the preliminary motion faster than planned." She understood immediately. "If we're already on record with the court, any further pressure against me becomes evidence of obstruction." Yes. And there it was again, that quality of attention that sharpened when she matched his frequency. "We file in 4 days instead of 2 weeks. I need everything from you by tomorrow evening. You'll have it tonight." "Kimberly." "Tonight," she said. "I'm not sitting still while he gets to keep moving." She could hear something shift in his breathing. "Tonight, then," he said. She arrived at his office at 7. She had dressed without thinking too carefully about it, which meant she had then stood in front of her small mirror for 3 minutes and thought about it quite carefully, and then put on exactly what she'd planned originally, because she refused to perform uncertainty in her own apartment. Dark green wrap dress, the good earrings, her natural hair pinned back at the crown and loose at her neck. She looked like herself. That was the point. He was already at his desk when she arrived, jacket off, tie loosened, papers spread across the surface in the organized complexity she'd come to recognize as his version of thinking out loud. He looked up when she walked in. Whatever he was about to say, he didn't say it immediately. His eyes moved over her once, not slowly, not elaborately, just once, the way a person looks when something catches them unexpectedly. And then he stood, which he didn't always do, and said, "Thank you for coming tonight." "Of course," she said, and sat down. They worked for 2 hours. She had brought everything. Her original complaint documentation, her shift logs from the month prior, A personal written account of every interaction with Gwak that she'd been keeping since the accusation, methodical and dated, because she had understood from the beginning that her word alone would never be enough, and she'd needed to build something more. He read the personal account without interrupting. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "You wrote this the week it happened?" he said. "Yes." "Before you had any indication of the video?" "Yes." He looked at her. "You were already building a case." "Someone had to," she said simply. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not the careful professional attention she'd catalogued, but something older and less managed. She felt it cross the distance between them like a change in temperature. "This account," he said quietly, "combined with the video and the committee documentation, Gwak doesn't walk away from this. I want you to understand that, not just the revocation reversal, the man himself." She had been careful not to want too much. Wanting too much had a way of converting into a specific kind of grief. But something about the way he said it, with that absolute, unhurried certainty, made her believe it in a way she hadn't let herself believe anything in months. "Okay," she said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. He was still looking at her. The office had gone very quiet around them. She was the one who shifted first, reaching for the next document. "The committee chair, you said his connection to Gwak goes back to a shared residency program." "Yes." He moved with her back to the work. But something had settled differently between them. A weight redistributed. A distance that no longer quite existed the way it had. They finished at 9:30. She was gathering her copies when he said, without looking up from what he was organizing, "Have you eaten?" She paused. "No. There's a place downstairs, noodles, nothing elaborate." He looked up then. "It's late. You shouldn't go home on an empty stomach." She studied him. He met her study evenly, the way he met everything, without flinching, without performing. "All right," she said. The restaurant was small and lit warmly and busy enough to feel anonymous. They sat across from each other in a booth and ordered without the formality of the office, and the shift in context did something to the space between them that Kimberly felt but didn't examine. He asked her about London, not strategically, not for case purposes, just asked the way a person did when they wanted to know something. She told him about the flat she'd shared with 3 other nursing students, the way the hospital there had felt vast and impersonal after Ghana's more intimate medical world, the specific cold of a London February that she had never fully made peace with. He listened the way he always listened, like what she said was the only thing in the room. "Why Seoul?" he asked. "A surgical nursing exchange, 6 weeks." She looked at her bowl. "I liked the precision of it here, the way medicine was practiced. I applied for the extended certification and stayed. And the language? I learned it because I was staying. It seemed discourteous not to." Something crossed his face. 6 years of fluency acquired as a matter of courtesy, he said. "That's not how most people think. Most people aren't me." "No," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, definite, like a conclusion reached after long consideration, made her look up. He was watching her with that expression again, the one she couldn't fully categorize, the one that felt less like a legal colleague and more like something she hadn't been offered in a long time, like being seen entirely, without reduction, without the flattening effect of other people's discomfort with who she was and what had happened to her. She felt it move through her chest like the first warm thing in a cold season. She looked back at her food. "We should talk about the filing timeline," she said. We should, he agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, or we could finish eating first. She looked up. The expression on his face was different now. The controlled gravity still there, but underneath it, unmistakably, something lighter, something that might, in another man, have been called warmth. She felt the corner of her mouth move. Fine, she said. Finish eating first. He walked her to the building entrance where Oh Hyun-gi waited with the quiet competence of a man who had seen many things and commented on none of them. At the door, Kimberly turned. "Tae-sang," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you. For tonight." "For—" She paused, because what she meant was larger than dinner, and she wasn't ready to say the larger thing. "For taking this seriously." "It was always serious," he said. "You were always worth taking seriously." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she went inside, and he stood on the pavement watching the door close, and Oh Hyun-gi had the profound professionalism to stare in the opposite direction entirely. The preliminary motion hit the nursing board like a stone through glass. Tae-sang filed on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon the board's legal office had called Attorney Bay 3 times. By Friday, the hospital's institutional lawyers had called Tae-sang twice, professionally, carefully, in the tone of people who had just looked at something and understood they were in trouble. He did not return the calls immediately. He let them sit for a day, because the discomfort of waiting was its own form of pressure, and no Tae-sang understood pressure the way musicians understood tempo, as something to be controlled, stretched, released at exactly the right moment. He called back on Saturday morning and was brief and courteous and gave nothing away, which was more frightening than any threat would have been. Kimberly heard about all of this through their now daily calls, which had migrated from scheduled check-ins to something less formal. She called when something came through, he called when something moved, and sometimes one of them called simply because the day had produced something worth saying out loud to a person who would understand it. She noticed the migration. She didn't stop it. Gwak's response came 8 days after the filing. He gave an interview. A carefully managed, strategically placed interview with a journalist who owed someone in his network a favor, published in a legal affairs outlet read primarily by medical professionals. He did not mention Kimberly by name. His lawyers had presumably advised against that, but he spoke at length about the weaponization of social media in professional disputes, the dangers of accusation culture, the way powerful external interests sometimes inserted themselves into institutional matters for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. External interests. The phrase was doing significant work. Tae-sang read it over his morning coffee and felt something cool and clarifying move through him. Gwak was not addressing the evidence. He couldn't address the evidence. He was trying to reframe the entire story, to make it about Tae-sang's involvement, about money and power and agenda, to shift attention from what was on that video to who had chosen to act on it. It was a smart move. It was also, Tae-sang recognized with the satisfied calm of a chess player watching an opponent commit to a losing strategy, a desperate one. He forwarded the article to Kimberly with a single line. "He's out of real options. This is noise." She replied within 2 minutes. "Loud noise." He almost smiled. "It always is at this stage. Don't engage. I never engage." A pause, then, "But I want to. I know." He set his phone down, then picked it up again. "Save it. There'll be a moment to speak. I'll tell you when." The moment she had not been prepared for came on a Tuesday evening when Jade called her name from the living room with a tone that made Kimberly walk out of her bedroom immediately. Jade had the television on. A news program, one of the evening current affairs shows that ran longer segments on developing stories. The segment currently running had a banner across the bottom of the screen that Kimberly read once, and then stood very still. Seoul Central Hospital investigation reopened. Nursing board cites procedural irregularities. The anchor was speaking. Kimberly heard words in sequence: preliminary motion, conflict of interest, committee composition, new evidence under review. And they assembled themselves into meaning slowly, the way things did when the thing being said was something you had been trying to believe for so long that the confirmation of it arrived strangely, like sound reaching you after the lightning. Jade was watching her. Kimberly sat down on the couch. Not from weakness, her legs simply made the decision independently, lowering her to the cushion with a deliberateness that felt almost courteous. Her phone buzzed. Tai sang. She answered. "You saw," he said. "Yes. It's the first step, not the last. I don't want you to—" "I know." She did know. She had been careful about hope for months, had rationed it like something that could run out. But even managed hope felt different than no hope, and right now something in her chest was warm in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. "I know it's not over." "It's not. Gwak will challenge the procedural finding. It goes to a review panel, which takes—" "Tai sang." She said his name quietly, the way she'd learned to when she needed him to stop building the next structure for a moment, and simply exist in the current one. "Can you just—" She paused. "Can we just sit with this for a minute?" A silence, then, softer than his usual register, "Yes." She leaned back against the couch. Jade had muted the television and quietly removed herself to the kitchen because Jade understood things without being told them. "I haven't cried," Kimberly said, half to herself. "I thought I would." "You will later," he said. "Probably when it's inconvenient." She laughed, a short, real sound surprised out of her. "That's very specific. It usually is. The body waits until you're safe enough." She absorbed that. "Is that from experience?" A pause. "Yes," he said simply. And she understood from the way he said it that it was the truth, and that it was also a door opened just a crack, an invitation to know something about him that he did not routinely offer. She did not push it wider. She held it gently. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. We're not finished." "I know. I'm thanking you for what's already happened." She looked at the silent television, the anchor still speaking, the banner still running. "You didn't have to take this. I told you. I know what you told me." She paused. "I'm asking about what you didn't tell me." The silence this time was longer. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait with him. Not anxiously, but with the particular patience of someone who had come to understand that his pauses were not evasions. They were the sound of a man choosing his words with the same precision he applied to everything. "You deserved someone who would," he said finally. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, "Come over." The words arrived before she'd fully decided to say them, but she didn't retract them. She was 37 days into carefully managing the distance between who he was in her life professionally and who he was becoming in it personally, and she was tired of managing it, and the investigation had just moved in a direction that meant she was allowed, maybe for the first time in months, to want something for reasons that had nothing to do with survival. Another silence, different from all the others. "Kimberly, Jade will be here," she said. "We can call it a case briefing if that's easier." "It wouldn't be a case briefing." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't." He arrived 40 minutes later. Jade opened the door, assessed him in approximately 4 seconds with the efficiency of a woman who translated for a living and therefore understood subtext as a professional discipline, and said, "I'll make tea," with the tone of someone who intended to make themselves extremely scarce. He sat across from Kimberly at the small kitchen table, not the conference table, not the restaurant booth, but her actual kitchen, with its second-hand chairs and the herbs Jade grew on the windowsill and the stack of tutoring notes Kimberly kept in a neat pile by the wall, because old professional habits died hard. He looked around the space without commenting, but she watched him take it in, the particular attention of a man who understood environments as information. "It's smaller than your office," she said. "Yes." His eyes came back to her. "It suits you more." She tilted her head. "Your office was always borrowed space," he said. "This is—" He paused. "There's evidence of you in it." She looked at the herbs, the tutoring notes, the small framed photograph of her mother on the shelf by the window. Evidence of her. She hadn't thought of it that way. "You notice things," she said. "I notice you," he said. It landed without ceremony, without the elaborate construction she might have expected from a man who chose words carefully. Just that, plain and direct, and more devastating for its simplicity. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "That's not a professional observation?" "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him across the small table. This controlled, careful, formidable man who had built walls that she suspected were older and thicker than anything he'd ever constructed professionally, and who was sitting in her second-hand kitchen chair looking at her like she was the reason he'd decided to leave one of them open. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was very still for a moment, then he turned it slowly, and his fingers closed around hers. Not tightly, not urgently, just with a settled, deliberate warmth that felt like something he'd made a decision about. They sat like that in her kitchen while Jade made extremely thorough and prolonged tea in the other room, and the city moved outside the window, and something that had been building for weeks settled quietly into place between them like a joint coming into alignment. The small, profound click of two things finally meeting where they were always going to meet. The review panel convened 3 weeks later. Kimberly sat in the anteroom of the nursing board's administrative building in a charcoal blazer and her good earrings, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed in that particular way she had. Not cold, not blank, but contained like a current running through insulated wire. Attorney Bay sat on her left, with a folder thick enough to be architectural. Tai Sang sat on her right. He was not her legal representative. Attorney Bay held that role formally. He was there, he had said, as a consultant. The nursing board knew exactly who he was and what his presence meant, which was precisely why he was there. She had not asked him to come. He had told her he would be there, in the same tone he used when something was already decided. And she had looked at him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had wanted him there. He had known that. They had passed through the stage of pretending otherwise sometime around the third evening he'd spent at her kitchen table, officially reviewing documents, actually just existing in the same space with the particular ease of two people who had stopped fighting the gravitational pull between them. They were not performing restraint anymore. They were simply careful, with each other, with the timing, with the understanding that what was building between them was real enough to deserve more than the compressed intensity of an ongoing crisis. He had kissed her once. 9 days ago at the door of her building after an evening that had ended later than either of them planned, in the amber light of the building entrance with Oh Hyun-gi demonstrating extraordinary professional vision in the opposite direction. It had been brief and deliberate and had communicated without ambiguity exactly what they both already knew. She had gone inside. She had pressed her back against the closed door in the dark entryway and stood there for a long moment, breathing. He had texted 20 minutes later. "Sleep well." She had typed back, "You too." Then deleted it and sent. That was not a professional development. His reply had arrived after a pause. That she'd understood meant he was, possibly for the first time in a long time, genuinely amused. No, it wasn't. The panel took 4 hours. Tai-Sang's documentation was presented methodically, the video authenticated and time-stamped. The committee composition analysis, mapping every professional connection between the 5 members and Dr. Gwak Byeong-chul. The suppressed complaint records, Kimberly's personal account, dated and detailed, and a legal precedent brief on procedurally compromised investigations that was thorough enough to be quietly devastating. Gwak's institutional lawyers were present and argued competently. Tai-Sang let Attorney Bay handle the responses, stepping in twice, once to cite a specific precedent the opposing counsel had mischaracterized, once to address a procedural question from the panel chair, with the kind of precise, unhurried authority that made the room go slightly quieter when he spoke. Kimberly watched the panel members' faces throughout. She had spent 9 years reading people in high-pressure medical situations. Des het die en de leute dernid, dent nastet to tida, nasa to tractada. There's at the micro-expressions of doctors delivering difficult news, of families receiving it, of patients deciding whether to trust what they were being told. She knew what doubt looked like. She knew what conviction looked like. By the 3rd hour, she could see which way this was going. The formal finding came 11 days later, delivered in a document that was dense with procedural language and unambiguous in its conclusion. The original investigation was declared procedurally void. The committee's conflicts of interest were formally documented. The nursing board issued a public statement acknowledging the irregularities and announcing the full reinstatement of Kimberly's nursing license, effective immediately. The statement was brief. The restoration it represented was not. She read it at Jade's kitchen table at 7 in the morning, still in her sleep clothes, coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down very carefully on the table, pressed both palms flat against the surface, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 4 months. Jade appeared in the kitchen doorway, read her face, and came to put both arms around her from behind without saying anything, which was exactly right. Kimberly cried then. Not for long, not loudly, but genuinely, the way her body had apparently been waiting to, since the night Tai-Sang had said usually when it's inconvenient. Her face pressed against Jade's forearm, and her shoulders shook twice, and then she straightened, pulled a breath in cleanly, and picked up her phone. She called him. He answered in one ring. "I know," he said. His voice was different. Not uncontrolled, but warmer than she had ever heard it. The careful management of it set aside just enough for her to hear what was underneath. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She closed her eyes. What happens to Gwak? The board's findings have been forwarded to the Medical Licensing Authority. There's a separate criminal referral for evidence tampering that my office submitted independently last week. He won't practice medicine in this country again. A pause. And he knows it. She sat with that. Justice was rarely cinematic in real time. It was usually paperwork and referrals and the slow machinery of institutions correcting themselves. But it was real. It had weight. "And Seo Daiwon?" she asked. I spoke to him this morning. He sends his regards. Something in Tae-sang's voice softened fractionally. Yulai apparently wants to know if the nurse who speaks French is okay. Kimberly laughed, sudden and bright. Tell him yes. Tell him to tell her yes. I will. Silence. The comfortable kind, the kind they'd gotten good at. Come tonight, he said. Not a question, but not the imperious version of not a question, the version that was an offering, a want made plain. Yes, she said. He lived in an apartment in Yongsan that was exactly what she'd expected and nothing she'd been prepared for. Clean lines, tall windows, a kitchen that looked rarely used, shelves of books organized in a way that revealed more about him than any conversation had. She moved through it slowly when he let her in, trailing her hand along the spines of a philosophy section that sat beside a row of legal texts that sat beside, inexplicably, 3 novels in French. She turned. He was watching her from the kitchen doorway. French novels, she said. I studied abroad, Paris, for a year. The ghost of something crossed his face. I kept meaning to return. Did you? Not yet. She held his gaze. Maybe there's still time. Something settled in his expression, not the controlled gravity she'd catalogued in that first meeting, not the sharpened professional attention, but something quieter and more permanent, like a man who had been standing in a hallway for a very long time and had just decided to walk through the door. He crossed the room. He touched her face first, just his hand against her jaw, thumb at the corner of her cheekbone, with the same deliberate, settled warmth as that night in her kitchen. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding it there. You're not a case I won, he said quietly. I know what I am to you, she said. Tell me. She looked at him. This man who had built walls out of precision and silence and was standing in his own living room looking at her like she was the only architecture that had ever felt like home. Something you didn't expect, she said. Something that changed the way the room felt. He exhaled, slow, complete, the breath of a man setting something down that he'd carried for longer than he should have. Stay tonight, he said. She nodded. What happened next lived in the space between what can be said and what only needs to be felt, in the warmth of his hands and the quiet of his apartment, and the particular tenderness of 2 people who had spent weeks being careful, finally choosing, deliberately and completely, not to be. The city moved outside his tall windows. Neither of them watched it. 6 weeks later, Kimberly returned to work. Not to Seoul Central, she had no desire to walk those corridors again. And there was a surgical nursing position at a private hospital in Mapo-gu that had reached out the morning after the board's public statement with an offer that was respectful in its speed and generous in its terms. She accepted it. She started on a Monday. The first day back in scrubs, back in the particular rhythm of a ward, the smell of it, the organized urgency, the way her body remembered exactly what to do. She stood at the nurse's station at the start of her shift and felt something in her chest that was too large and too quiet to be named simply. She was home. The night she told Tae-sang about her first day, they were in his apartment, which had become, by degrees and without formal announcement, somewhere she spent most of her evenings. She was on the couch with her feet tucked under her, telling him about a patient who had refused the nebulizer treatment until she'd explained it 3 different ways, and he was watching her from the opposite cushion with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he had something to say and was deciding when to say it. She stopped mid-sentence. What? He reached into the space beside him, unhurried, deliberate, and produced a small box, not wrapped elaborately, just a box held in his steady hands offered across the distance between them. "Tai-sung, open it." She did. Inside, on a simple cushion, was a ring, not ostentatious, nothing that announced itself from across a room, but beautiful in its precision. A single deep blue stone set in pale gold, chosen with the same careful attention he applied to everything that mattered to him. She looked up. He had moved closer without her noticing, the way he sometimes moved, with the economy of a man who didn't waste motion. He was near enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw that meant this mattered to him more than he was performing. "I'm not asking because the case is over," he said. "I'm asking because the case was never what this was about. You were never—" He paused, chose his words. "You were never just something I was fixing, Kimberly. You were something that broke me open. And I find I don't want to close again." Her throat was tight. She pressed her lips together. "You could have anyone," she said. Not self-deprecation, just honesty, the kind she'd always offered him because he'd always deserved it. "I could," he agreed simply. "I want you." She looked at the ring in the box. At this man who had walked into the wreckage of what had been done to her and built something new in it. Not out of pity, not out of agenda, but out of the particular stubborn conviction of someone who recognized something real and refused to walk away from it. She thought of a little girl playing with a phone in a hospital corridor, recording 11 seconds of a bad man's cruelty without knowing that what she'd captured was also, obliquely, a beginning. The thread that would unspool into this room, this man, this moment. She took the ring from the box. She placed it in his hand, then held her hand out, steady, decided, unambiguous. He slid it onto her finger without looking away from her face. "Yes," she said, not in answer to a question, but as a declaration. The kind that needed no follow-up, no conditions, no careful management. Just the word, full and final, offered from someone who had survived 4 months of having her truth disbelieved and had come out the other side knowing with absolute certainty the difference between what was real and what wasn't. This was real. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles. Quiet, complete. The gesture of a man who had come to the end of all his careful distance and found he didn't miss it. Outside the tall windows, Seoul moved through its evening, indifferent and luminous, the way cities did, carrying everything and knowing nothing of what mattered inside the small, warm spaces within them. Inside, Kimberly laughed softly at something he said, and No Tae-sang, who had not smiled easily in longer than he could account for, smiled back at her in his own apartment like a man who had finally, improbably, come home. The end.